Y'all, there are other videos that I've seen on the interwebs talking about oils versus acrylics versus watercolor. And I have to say, there's a lot of wrong information being given out there. So I'm going to do my best, to the best of my ability, to fix this, to fix these problems, to fix these oversights, okay? Because when you are trying to figure out a medium right for you, you got to know what you're up against. What are the pros? What are the cons? And today we're talking about the big three. I don't know why I said it like that. Today we're going to be talking about the big three, okay? Oils, acrylics, and watercolor, all right? And which one will work for you. Part of the process of figuring that out is knowing what you're up against. So without further ado, let's just jump in and we'll start talking about oil paints, okay? Now, what are some of the pros of an oil paint? Well, I would say it's a pro that for the most part, now I'm making some generalizations here. Why is everybody looking around? Okay, so let's start with oils. And I do want to preface all of this with saying that I will be making some generalizations. There are always going to be outlying factors that will depend on your technique, and we'll be talking about regular oils. And yes, you might say like, well, there's water mixable oils, but we're keeping it to the big three. Why do I have to keep saying it like that? I can't even know if I can say it properly. Big three. Anyway, so oils. There's a lot of pros of the oils, okay? One of the things that I like about oils is, first of all, if I'm selling my paintings, they sell for more. Yeah, you can sell your oil paintings for more than an acrylic painting or even a watercolor painting. Oils command that value. The other thing about oils that's really nice is the pigment loads. Unlike acrylic, where you have a maximum amount of pigment you can put into the paint, there is no official max limit. Acrylics have a maximum pigment load. If you go over the maximum pigment load, they will lose their waterproof retention properties. Okay, you basically get a form of acrylic gouache where it can reactivate with water. It's not acrylic gouache, but that's essentially how acrylic gouache becomes so pigmented. It has more pigment than the acrylic polymer can handle. But this isn't about acrylic gouache. We're talking about watercolor, oil, and acrylic. So there's a maximum pigment load there. With oil paint, there isn't really a maximum pigment load. And if you've tried brands like Old Holland, for example, those are brands that are jam-packed with pigment. They have huge pigment loads. And you can really tell with, first of all, the weight of the tube, but second of all, just how stiff they are, because the wax and oil ratio to pigment is lower. So why would anybody want that? Well, I mean, they do make very vibrant colors, and also they do go a long way because there's so much pigment in them. So that's a benefit. They're also very blendable. They mix together very nicely, and I do really think that one of the things that is often overlooked, because look, I can't say with authority whether acrylic paint will last for 100 years. I can't say with authority it will last for 200 years. The reality of it is that acrylics have only been around for less than 100 years. So look, I don't believe that they are going to spontaneously combust, but we do know through history, because oil is a very traditional medium that's been used for centuries, millennia. Is it millennium? Millenni? It's been around a while. Let's just put it that way. Okay, it's been around a very long time, traditional medium, and it's the medium of like the old masters, and people feel very good about themselves when they're using the mediums of the old masters, and they should. It's very luxurious. There is something about the smells of the oil paints and the experience of working with them. Okay, they have a very slow drying time, which means that you can work a painting for a very long time before worrying about it drying on you. Acrylic paints will dry very quickly. And an oil paint, especially if you're doing portraiture work or really anything, having more open time can be helpful in some painting applications. For some reason, there is something so luminous about oil paints. They really seem to glow. They're the pregnant woman of oil color. They just have a glow about them. I don't know what it is. What? My wife glows when she's pregnant, okay? I've seen it happen once. It's beautiful. Shut up, Will. I love you. They glow. They really do. They have a very luminous appearance to them. There's a lot of depth in oil painting. That doesn't mean you can't achieve that in other mediums, but there's just something particularly just nice. You know what I mean? And one of the biggest pluses, I think, when it comes to oil paint is out of all three mediums, they basically have the lowest color shift. Now, I did an entire artist problem on color shift, which we can stick in the rear of this video with a link to, where we talk about color shift. But oil paints generally have the lowest color shift, which means once you put the color down and it dries, it will look as similar as it did to when it was wet than when it's dry, unlike acrylic that will dry a little off, darker. And of course, not to mention that there are tons of painting techniques that go along with oil paint. I mean, glazing and scumbling and impasto, you know, I mean, really just tons of stuff. It's a very versatile medium. Now let's talk about some of the cons, okay? Because there are drawbacks to oil paint. One of the first things I mentioned was how oil paintings can sell for more than watercolor and acrylic. But they also cost more to do. They are generally more expensive in terms of not just really the paint necessarily, but you know, you really should be using an oil primed canvas, which can cost a little more instead of an acrylic primed canvas. You know, there are mediums that are necessary and involved. And getting into that, that's another drawback, is that there's a lot of things with oil paints where you have to be careful. There are fumes involved with most oil painting, unless you're using something like, you know, I've mentioned a million times, Chelsea Classical's lavender or citrus brush cleaner. You know, these fumes will give you headaches. Odorless thinner does not mean safe. These are products with no known carcinogens. But whether you use Chelsea or just use water mixable oils, you don't have to deal with those fumes, but it is something to know about going into it. I would say out of all three mediums, oil paints are the most difficult to use. But once you kind of get the rules, you will have a better time. So like, what are some of the rules? Like fat over lean, painting fat over lean. Well, what does that mean? You know, and that was a whole video on its own. Maybe we'll stick that in the rear as well. You fat over lean, because it drives me nuts, as I think I do in the thumbnail. Fat over lean. They require a lot of special cleanup stuff, like brush cleaners, and they require brush conditioners, and you know, of course, there's also the pain in the butt of handling with disposing of them because they don't go down the drain, and you have to kind of learn how to make it work for you. And you know, one of the best tips that I always tell people is when you use a brush cleaner, a solvent, especially something that's expensive, because the Chelsea Classical Studio is not cheap stuff, but this little bottle can go a long way. When you paint, you pour it in a little cup, and after you're done painting, you just let it sit. Let it sit for a couple hours, and you'll see all that pigment just kind of go all the way down to the bottom, sink to the bottom. I then take it, pour it into a different container. That's clean brush cleaner. And just maybe like take a napkin or something and just scoop and throw away that leftover pigment in the bottom. This can last you actually a fairly decent time. Again, everything's depending on your painting techniques. Now, it's funny because I talk about the pros of things, but these pros can also be cons. So I mentioned that oil paints dry very slowly, and it's a big pro for some people. Other people might want things to dry a little quicker. Now, brands like Lucas over here will dry to the touch generally in about 24 hours, depending on where you live and the humidity in the air and how thick you painted it. But other brands will stay wet for days, weeks. I mean, it stays wet a long time. If a day still seems like a very long time to you, then, you know, when we get into acrylics, I think I'll have something more to your liking. One of my notes about the cons of oils is it's just a pain in the ass. It's a pain in the ass. It's a high maintenance. This is the supermodel date of paints. You'll be dealing with toxic chemicals if you use odorless thinner or just straight up turpentine, because you are a badass. You will need special ventilation. You do not want to be breathing this stuff in. It is bad for you. It can cause the cancer, which nobody wants. I also find that of all the mediums, oil painting takes up the most real estate, okay? It takes a lot of space. You gotta store mediums, and you gotta store your tubes of paint, and you need your canvases, and your easel, and your palette, and your da-da-da-da. Okay, he keeps going. I find that in general, when I look at different studio spaces, oil paint needs the most space for some reason. Along with that expensive material, you really should be using natural hair brushes. As much as I preach that I personally use synthetic brushes, but I don't do a lot of oil painting. Natural hair brushes really do give you the best performance when working with oil paints, and they can be more expensive. Again, we're using general terms here. You can find cheap oil paint, you can find super expensive acrylic paint. There's always outliers, but in general, these are kind of the things that I wanted to cover. Now, although there is very low color shift in oil paint, they are the oil that has the tendency to yellow over time. But that will depend on the type of oil that's used. So linseed oil it can be yellowing over time. That means that the oil kind of starts to show its ugly face. However, a lot of brands of paint use different oils or combinations of oils to limit this. There are then downsides to those other oils. So you might see a paint that's done in poppy oil, for example, or what's another oil, Katie? Safflower oil, right? You know, these are considered non-yellowing oils. However, the reason that linseed oil is used so frequently, it is the most flexible of all of the oils, where those other oils can become more brittle, and you have to make sure that you don't roll up your canvas if it's done with a lot of brittle paint. So these are some of these rules, and just so many like little things and nuances. It takes a while to kind of fully understand the materials, but then once you finally understand the materials, the painting process is actually quite luxurious. I think that's the give and take. Now let's move into our acrylic paints. Okay, we'll talk about the pros and cons of acrylics. So, what are some of the nice things about acrylic paint? Well, for me, nice thing, these things are easy to clean up. They don't require a lot of different things. You can just use water to clean your brushes, clean your palette, whatever you're cleaning. If you're using a palette and you let the paint dry, most palettes for acrylics are designed that the paint just peels off. There's no scrubbing or scraping or all the wonderful things that go into using things like oil paint to clean. They're very convenient that way. That also means you don't need any toxic chemicals, you don't need any special ventilation. There's nothing really that's airborne that's going to necessarily give you a hard time unless you're using a solvent-based varnish at the end. Another wonderful thing about acrylics, they are very fast drying. If you apply a layer of paint, it can be dry in 7, 10, 15 minutes, depending on, again, how thick you painted and the weather conditions. That allows you to move very quickly from layer to layer to layer because the paint's set up so quickly, and that's a good thing. They're very easy to use, they're very accessible, they are user-friendly. You're not really worrying about fats over leans and all this nonsense. They're pretty much straightforward and easy to get started in. They don't have to cost a lot to get started in. They don't have to take up a lot of space to get started in. But if you do use acrylics and get serious and you want to, you can expand it to the size of an oil painting operation. I mean, you can paint huge canvases on huge easels with your huge brush. And, you know, go to town. The ideal brushes for acrylic paints are synthetic, which are generally less expensive than natural hair brushes. They are also animal friendly, unlike Will. Look, you can find, as I said, cheap oils, cheap acrylics, cheap watercolor. You can find ridiculously expensive watercolor, acrylic, and particularly really expensive oil color, okay? like damn. And you know what? They command the price. The artists that are buying at that level really want that particular painting experience. So it is what it is. Finally, acrylic paints are the most flexible. Now, I'm not talking about ease of use when I talk about flexibility. I'm talking about yoga. Okay, these paints flex. So if you're painting on a stretched canvas, for example, and you want to store it, you will have the safest time taking it off the bars, rolling it up, and then restretching it later than you would with oil paints where, we kind of touched on like, well, did they use linseed oil, which is kind of like, more flexible, or did they use like a poppy oil, which is more brittle? Will my paintings crack? You don't have to worry about that quite as much with acrylic paints when used properly. And they clean up very well with water, but I will say this again, do not use water as your mediums, okay? Now, I did a whole video talking about using water as your medium, and people fired back at me saying, Golden has been doing extensive testing, and this is a myth, and this isn't true. And you know what? I was looking at what they were saying. Let me explain to you what's going on here, okay? Why am I saying to you, don't use water as a medium with your acrylics? For all intents and purposes, acrylic is a glue with pigment, okay? So I want you to think about a bottle of Elmer's glue, sticky wicket glue, yeah. Think about a bottle of sticky wicket glue. Jamie, put one in my hand. Thank you. It's way more work than it was necessary, right? Just put up like a block picture that's like, you know what I mean? Like just obviously not like, yeah, you didn't have to do a good job, but okay, you have your sticky wicket glue. Now I want you to imagine that you take some of that glue out, right? You squeeze some out and you paste down a piece of paper on another. Okay, you let that set up. Now, instead of just doing that every time you take some of that glue out, we're going to fill the bottle back up to where it was with water. So we're just going to put in a little water because we only used a little bit of glue. Okay, and I'm going to shake it up. Okay, like a shampoo bottle trying to get the last of the conditioner out. Then you're going to take that and you're going to glue two pieces of paper together. Okay, it'll still probably stick, okay? But now when you go back, you're going to add more water and then more water. And what you'll eventually find is that your glue is going to turn to a Post-it note type adhesive consistency. Okay, adhesion is the name of the game with acrylics, and as you add more water, the adhesion weakens because you're breaking the molecular bond of the acrylic polymer, okay? Yes, there are ways that you can make it work, especially if you're doing just like one layer of like a wash. It might not be waterproof, but it probably won't crack if you roll it up. But if you paint over that, you're painting a stronger acrylic bond on top of a weaker one. These don't lead to good structural integrity, and I just highly advise against it. Look, I'm saying it with peace and love. You can do what you want, but think about that glue bottle, because that's essentially what you're doing, is you're watering down the glue. Acrylics are extremely forgiving, way more forgiving than my parents were. They are easily painted over. Katie's laughing at that because she knows what I'm talking about. They are easily painted over once they're dry, okay? So covering up a mistake is so simple. They are very, very, very good at giving you second, third, fourth, fifth chances, okay? You can paint over with oil, but like I said earlier, depending on how long it takes, it can be a real pain in the butt to do that. Also, because they dry so quickly, you can varnish acrylic paintings quickly. When using an acrylic varnish, or when varnishing an acrylic, I should say, be conscientious of whether or not you're using an acrylic varnish or a solvent-based varnish for acrylics. There is a difference. And of course, I did an entire video on varnishing, but just for a little peace of mind, if you use an acrylic varnish over acrylic paints, essentially what you're doing is unifying the sheen and nothing more. Some acrylic varnishes will have UV blockers, giving it a little bit of protection from direct light and fading. But the real purpose of varnish is to apply a layer on top of your painting that's removable for cleaning. So a number of years ago, they went and they cleaned the Sistine Chapel. And everybody was like, these colors, they came in after it was cleaned. It was like, this looks like a cartoon. Like, what the heck? It was dirty. They cleaned it, and the vibrant colors that were underneath shined again, to the point where they thought that they went in with a cartoon artist and fluffed all the color saturation up. So yeah, that's a thing. So you can varnish them immediately, unlike an oil paint where you need to wait a minimum of 6 months before you varnish those, because they take that long to fully, completely cure and dry. So yeah. Quick and easy. So now let's talk about the acrylic cons, okay? Well, I mentioned that they're very fast drying. That's also a con, okay? Just depends on the type of painter you are. If you are if you're a plein air painter, quick drying acrylics is a huge con, because they will dry particularly fast outside, especially if you're in the sun. It's windy, it's hot. They'll dry on you way too quick, and it's just not even worth trying. Really, you should be using watercolor or oil paint for your needs. They do make different types of acrylic retarder. Some acrylics that have retarder already in them, like the Golden's Open, and some that have a retarding medium that you add to your paints that will increase the drying time. So that goes back to the versatility of the product and it being kind of forgiving. You can control. It won't give it the lifespan of an oil paint in terms of open time, but it will increase it. Another thing I wanted to mention about the pros of acrylics and versatility is the versatility of the body of the paint. So acrylic can be made to be thick like an oil paint, or it can be made thinned down like cream, like heavy cream, okay? It can be thinned down so much there is acrylic ink, okay? It can be used for impasto techniques. It can be used for pouring medium techniques. It's so versatile, they can make it in so many different forms, so you can find something that works just for you and what you're trying to do. I would suggest, if you are new and really don't know what you want to do yet, finding a medium to heavy body, just normal acrylic paint, and then figuring out for yourself, I like painting it really thick, I like painting it really thin, and then, you know, going off into some of those more specialty type paints. So your acrylic paints will not sell for as much as your oil paints generally. Again, I'm using generalizations generally, but also keep in mind that you probably did not spend as much on all those materials. Again, not always. I have to keep saying that because somebody out there is going to be like, you know, you don't understand it. I was like, no, I get it, okay? I'm talking gross generalizations. In fact, it's bordering on stereotypical. Acrylic paints, especially if not used properly, especially if water's used, will dry flatter looking than most other paints, particularly oils. Okay, you know how I talked about with oils you have that depth to them. Acrylic paints can dry looking flatter, and it's up to the artist to kind of maintain, like I said, those sheens. Do you want them to be glossy? Do you want them to be semi-gloss? Maybe you want it to be matte. You know, those are all things, part of the versatility that you can do with adding mediums to these paints. So just keep that in mind. I mean, there is that depth to oil paints, and it is achievable with acrylics the more you master it and you get to know sheen and you use the proper mediums for what you're trying to do. They will dry a shade darker than when you painted them, and the sheen may change. A lot of acrylic, when you put it down, looks glossy, but when it dries, it will not stay glossy. Now, if you look at these right here, these are here, let me find one with the label that looks good. See how it says high gloss? Okay, so these are designed to be shiny, and in fact, when I've worked with these, they dry very similarly in sheen to the way they look when they're wet. Okay, they do dry a shade darker, but because of that high gloss, they still look wet, which can add to some glow. Now, the reason that certain brands don't add gloss is because some people don't want it to be quite that glossy, and they add some matte medium to that. But to try to matte down a glossy paint will dramatically cut the intensity, where if you have a matte paint that you add gloss to, the intensity of the color won't be affected nearly as much. In fact, it will probably be enhanced a little. They're still relatively new. I mean, look, under a century of real artist experience with these paints. So that's just, you know, not really a huge issue, but it is something to consider that this hasn't been around a long time. It isn't tried and true, tested through the centuries. Old masters did not use acrylic paints. I can't even say that post-contemporary artists used, I don't even know what post-contemporary means. Did I just make that art movement up? No, that's a thing. Not a lot of artists in history have used acrylics, and we don't know exactly how the paintings will last, but there's a very good chance, if you believe in something called science, that they will last a very long time. Finally, moving on to the third medium, we are going to be talking about watercolors. Watercolors are my jam piece, okay? They don't have to cost a lot to get started. They take up very little room. They are extremely accessible. I can put an entire watercolor studio in my pants, as I've done in a video. Really, it doesn't take up a lot of space. It can literally take up so little space, it fits in my pants. I mean, believe me, not a lot's fitting in there. Or you can have a whole big production. You know, you can be a plein air painter. You can have special easels for bringing your watercolors with you. Watercolor requires no chemicals, very little mediums. I mean, they make mediums for watercolor, but for learning how to paint, you don't really need much. I mean, maybe you might have a teacher that adds masking fluid or uses gum arabic, but really, to get started, you don't need to invest in a lot of stuff. Just, get yourself a nice set of artist quality watercolor. Now, watercolor also comes in two convenient forms, tube and cake or pan, as we call them here in the US. It's essentially the same thing, just one has been dried out because they both re-wet. Watercolor re-wets, watercolor re-wets. I guess there's no with water. Watercolor re-wets. So that is part of the beauty of the paint, that once it dries on your palette, the paint isn't expired. Save that palette, re-wet it with some water, use a little spritz bottle, and keep using them. They don't really go bad that way, where a oil or an acrylic paint can start to skin up over time and eventually harden. Super quick setup, super quick cleanup, super accessible, super easy to get started in. Also, when it comes to watercolor papers, they make watercolor blocks where the paper is sealed on all the sides. That gives you a really good option for painting and not worrying about the paper buckling. Just let it dry before you cut the paper out from the block, because it's basically glued on all the sides except for a corner where you just take a butter knife or a palette knife and The other thing I like about watercolor is that it's very unique when you consider all the oil painters and all the acrylic painters out there. Watercolor has its own unique look to it. A very, very, more subtle, do you pronounce the B? Subtle look to it. But it can also have an intensity to it. Really, but it has its own jam, and that's what I like about it. It has its own look to it, okay? So there's a lot of pros when it comes to using watercolor. You can use natural brushes, you can use synthetic brushes, you can paint them on, there are now watercolor canvases, you can paint them on paper. The paper changes, you can have it in hot press, cold press, rough, whatever you want. There's a lot of options, and again, doesn't have to cost a fortune to get started. So why doesn't everybody just get started in watercolors? Well, you haven't let me get to the cons yet, okay? Now this is the most important thing, all right? We talked at the beginning about the oils being the most difficult to get started in, but once you get the fundamentals down, which can take a while, you sort of get a groove. Watercolor is the opposite. Watercolor is the easiest to get started in. Basically, it's understanding, evaporation. I mean, it's basically, dry, not dry, whatever. But it is by far the most challenging to fully master. To be able to manipulate the paint and create what you are seeing in your mind's eye or trying to replicate from a picture, photo, real life, to fully master it, it is the most complex. It is the least forgiving of all the mediums. There really is not a paint over technique when it comes to watercolor. If you make a mistake, 9 times out of 10 you're going to have to find a way to make it part of your painting that you weren't anticipating. It's happy accidents that really are sound like a pirate now, really are challenging. So yeah, there are some cons to them. I would not say, though, in my experience, in my opinion, again, this is opinion now, that the cons are enough to deter me from going to watercolors. I love them. I'm okay not being a watercolor master yet. I'm okay not being a watercolor master. I'm enjoying the ride. And that really needs to be the name of the game, especially if you don't sell your art to make a living. If this is a hobby to you, this is something you do to relax. If you are not relaxed, you are doing it wrong, okay? So don't take yourself so seriously. Enjoy the process, and you will have a great time with watercolor. Now, you can spend a fortune on watercolor stuff too. It doesn't have to be cheap or small. As I said, there are lots of options out there, but I always really recommend finding a paint that is of artist quality, because they will mix the easiest, they will give you the best results, and especially if you're just starting out, you're going to need all the confidence you can get. So if there is a less likelihood that you will mix mud or your colors will remain vibrant because you're using artist quality, it will be less likely to deter you from thinking like, well, this doesn't look as good as I thought it would, So quality materials are important, and there's enough out there where you can buy, like our Turner watercolors, our Lucas watercolors. These are very high-end these are professional products here that are not nearly as expensive as some of the other leading national brands, and the reason for that is that we import them directly, and you're not paying for a distributor that has set a MAP price, a minimum advertised price, which means we're only allowed to sell it for a certain point. You can't go any lower. We kind of set the price point for these, and we buy direct from the manufacturer. So that's how you can get artist quality without spending artist quality prices. Watercolor also follows slightly different rules, okay? You know, we talked about acrylics drying a shade darker, oils having a little bit of color shift. If anything, they may yellow over time. Mostly colors like white are the ones you have to look out for with the yellowing, especially if it's like a linseed based oil white, but very few manufacturers, unless it's like in big letters, use linseed oil in their white paints for oils. But what makes watercolor unique is I find that they don't dry lighter, they don't dry darker, they dry paler than when they're wet. They kind of lose some of the color intensity, but not to the point where it's like, well, what's the point of having these? You know, you can create vibrant colors. You just have to make sure that your water to paint ratio is stronger. But no matter how black you lay down an ivory black, it will dry a little paler. That's just the name of the game with watercolors. And as you work with them, you learn to understand it and love it, as I have learned to love them. Every single one of these mediums is going to require practice to get better. It is what it is, okay? It is what it is. And an equal amount of practice. So even though oils will require practice in the beginning of learning how to use them and then sort of balance out more like an acrylic paint to some degree of what your expectations are, your practice with watercolor will not be in learning the materials as much as controlling them, controlling water, controlling lifting, and all those other wonderful things that go into the unique look of watercolor. Generally speaking, I find that most people that are just starting out in art, they want to be, maybe they won't give themselves the credit. I don't want to be an artist. I want to do some art. Generally, they start with acrylic paint. Generally, not always. A lot of that also has to do with whether or not they're finding a teacher first, and they're going to use what their teacher uses. If they're teaching in acrylic and you have oil, then it'll be a problem, so you'll want what your teacher uses. But if you're doing this on your own, you don't really have a particular teacher in mind quite yet, or you have a choice of classes, acrylic is a great entryway place to start. It's kind of like the balancing of everything in terms of just the ease of watercolor and some of the forgivingness of oils. It really comes together very nicely in acrylics. But it really doesn't matter if you try watercolor or if you try the acrylics or the oils. Try me on Instagram at Mike Not Jerry, where I will continue to post things about whatever the hell I want. That's what I do. That's what I do. As we start to wrap up this year, we will be ramping down on our Artist Problem series. I'm ready to conquer new things, new videos. We have a lot of exciting things coming up, but don't you fret. Listen, constant viewer, you and I have been through a lot of these videos together. We've done hundreds of these, right? For your entertainment pleasure, for your consideration, if you would like to continue to see me and my shenanigans, because that's really what it is. This is not business, this is monkey business. Believe it or not, we have formed the It's Mike Not Jerry YouTube channel. Right, and you can go to it right now for free, worked it out with your internet provider. You can subscribe to the It's Mike Not Jerry YouTube channel. Mike Not Jerry was taken. We'll put a little link or something. I don't know. It's youtube.com/It's Mike Not Jerry. I'm saying this with peace and love. This is not art related. This is not appropriate. This is me, okay? So if you want me like full force, that's what you're going to get. So brace yourself. And for those of you that are excited about it, good. You know, it's a lot of me. I don't know. Some people want to see it. Most people don't. Who knows? But I also wanted to just say how much I appreciate all the support and love that we've been getting doing these artist problems, and And yeah, and we still have a couple more in store for you, so you can look forward to those. I hope that no animals were harmed too badly in the making of this video. The fly, I don't want to talk about the fly. Oh! Okay. I know it's... Will, you don't whack off my paint. All right, this is artist problems. There's a fly in my studio. Let's do this another day.